Money can be a large part of our lives. So much of our time is devoted to earning it, our survival is so often dependent on having it, and often our worth is inextricably linked to it. Yet it remains socially constructed. Currency is given value through our collective belief that it is valuable. Being socially constructed doesn't make it any less real, or its effect on your life any more or less meaningful. It simply acknowledges who controls that value. Concepts like money that are socially constructed can have physical, tangible aspects too. Paper money is real, I can touch it, feel it, yet the concept of money remains socially constructed. Section 1. What is sex? Let's talk about sex. Unfortunately, not the fun kind, but biological sex. The categories that we are placed into based on the sex characteristics of our bodies. We understand sex to be a binary, either male or female, but how we sort people into those categories is a bit of a contentious topic. Currently, we assign sex at birth based on genitalia and not much else. This might seem like a simple and straightforward approach, but when it comes to sex, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. A not insignificant amount of babies are born with ambiguous genitalia, genitals that cannot be said to be wholly male or wholly female, with many showing aspects of both male and female genitals. So what's to be done about these outliers? Currently, in most cases, doctors will perform corrective surgery on the infants, pushing the genitals to more closely resemble the male and female forms that we are familiar with. Though even after altering the results that don't conform with our simple sex binary, we still run into babies that can't be easily sorted into male or female. Because this only happens in relatively few cases, many are tempted to ignore or disregard this evidence. But ignoring these exceptions in order to say males are born with penises, females are born with vaginas, is an accident. No, I don't mean that it was said unintentionally. I mean that it's an example of the logical fallacy of accident. The fallacy, also known as destroying the exception, occurs when, among other cases, a categorical statement is made without a qualifying word, like many or most. Since the only true statement we can make when assigning sex based on genitals at birth is most males are born with penises and most females are born with vaginas, we know that it is not the undeniable, unquestionable, and universal method of assigning sex that it's made out to be. So if we can't determine sex based solely on genitals, there must be another way that we can be sure of someone's sex, right? Well, if you've ever taken a high school biology class, you know it's actually much more simple than these science-denying snowflakes are making it out to be. If you have XX chromosomes, you're female, XY, and you're male. Although, it's not actually that simple. Consider the story of cis woman Maria Jose Martinez Padino, a Spanish hurdler who fell victim to this faulty belief. Starting in 1968, women athletes were required to undergo genetic testing to confirm their sex before they were allowed to compete. In 1983, Maria qualified to compete in the World Track and Field Championship in Finland. Her genes were tested, confirmed, and she was granted a certificate of femininity. Luckily, the process for receiving a certificate of femininity has since been streamlined. Mine arrived shortly after I had to tell a guy 3 times that I was a lesbian before receiving a picture of his dick anyway. Our story picks up again in 1985 when Maria attended the World University Games in Japan. She forgot to bring her certificate and was forced to undergo another genetic test. The night before the race, Maria was informed that there was a problem with her test, and she would not be allowed to compete until a months-long karyotype analysis was undertaken. Maria was understandably distraught. Nothing in her life had indicated she was anything less than normal. After 2 nerve-wracking months, she finally discovered that despite having a perfectly normal female development, she had XY chromosomes. She was born with an androgen insensitivity, and her body doesn't respond to testosterone, leading to female development instead of male. Luckily, her case, and others like her, encouraged the end of genetic testing to determine sex. But the ideas behind those tests still linger today, despite many other examples demonstrating the faults of relying on chromosomes to determine sex, including a wide range of intersex conditions. If we can't rely on genitals, and we can't use chromosomes to determine sex, then what can we use? Well, there are other indicators of biological sex, including hormones and secondary sex characteristics like facial hair or breasts. But it doesn't take an expert to see that these two are not enough to determine sex on their own. It's relatively normal to develop secondary sex characteristics that don't align with your assigned sex at birth. Certainly men with gynecomastia would not agree with being labeled female. Unfortunately, that brings us to the conclusion that there is no foolproof single way to determine sex without fail. Every method is subject to fault of one kind or another. So if we are to insist that sex is a biological truth, then how do we determine it objectively? An interesting answer is to look at sex as a cluster property. Boyd's homeostatic cluster property theory of metaethical naturalism is best described in another video by a devilishly good-looking Jordan Peterson fan, but for our purposes, we can think of cluster properties as a collection of objective properties that tend to go together to define certain words or concepts. This theory allows us to view male or female not as a single concrete and provable property, but a collection of objective properties that allowed the phrase, "Chelsea is female," to be objectively true. However, the phrase is still only objectively true relative to the situation in which it is said. We can't know to which specific property or properties in the cluster of female the speaker is referring to. It's entirely likely Chelsea possesses properties in both the cluster of female and the cluster of male. The sex of Chelsea is left entirely to the speaker, something we will learn later on can be very dangerous. This inherent subjectivity doesn't mean that this process is unhelpful or worthless. In general, the system we have for determining sex works. Most people are covered and experience no issues. We've used this system for centuries. What, you're gonna walk out tomorrow and proclaim a new system? What we have works, and it's not like people aren't trying to improve it. So if a few people get left out until it's fixed, that's just the cost of doing business. Section 2. Trans people. It's important to look at how we do things and how we could do better. I've avoided talking about trans people until now, but they are distinctly affected by the system, especially if they've undergone hormone therapy or any affirming surgeries. Under the current healthcare system, at least in the United States, there's often only a male or female sex classification. But transgender and intersex people can have any combination of sex characteristics and may not receive the care they need under a system that allows only these choices. For example, my insurance company classifies me as female, so I can expect certain exams and operations, like a breast cancer screening, to be available to me at a hopefully reasonable price. However, since I have some male sex characteristics, some exams or operations I may need in the future might not be covered under my insurance. If I should come to need prostate cancer treatment in the future, however unlikely that is, I may be unable to pay for adequate treatment because prostate cancer shouldn't be possible in female-sexed people. Additionally, advice and notices may not be entirely accurate. Take a look at this recommendations page I received upon logging into my insurance website. I'm fairly certain I won't be having a cervical cancer screening anytime soon. The web system is unable to handle trans or intersex people. A potential solution to this issue of sex generalization could be to simply provide care and define someone's sex individually, instead of assuming their sex characteristics based on a label that may or may not apply given the circumstances. To personalize instead of generalize. This more individualistic approach would benefit everyone, and I know non-binary and intersex people would appreciate not being forced into a binary system. Male and female do work as broad categories, and they can be useful in making general claims about all humans. But when talking about smaller groups or individuals, they can be misleading or downright inaccurate. This is something that certain groups and people have been using to justify their hate and bigotry.
I mean, even to this day, I view myself and I operate through the world and my ID says female and everything, but I know what I am. Technically, I know what I am. I'm a male and I was born male, I'll die male.
Or a few thousand from the border tomorrow.
I'm wondering why we've gone off on this tangent as a society where acknowledging realities like biological sex is suddenly transphobic. And I also wonder why and how that invalidates trans people. I actually recently tweeted that biological sex is real and that trans people wouldn't exist if biological sex wasn't real. If my biological sex wasn't male, I would have never transitioned. So, yeah.
Trans women are women. They live the life of a woman and they use female pronouns. But they will always be biologically male.
Okay, are trans women biologically male? Well, it depends on the individual. Whether she has had hormone therapy or not, whether she has had any surgeries. It just isn't possible to give a definitive and objective answer. Absolute sex is, as we've learned, subjective, relative to a person's beliefs rather than to any objective truth. Different people will assign sex differently. Complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, as discussed in the story of Maria, results in female sex characteristics and development, but lacking female gonads and chromosomes. Despite being socialized and recognized as female, many TERFs, or trans-exclusionary radical feminists, would still call a woman with this condition male because she lacks female reproductive abilities and chromosomes. Yet, some genetic females are born with very similar anatomy to those with androgen insensitivity and also lack the ability to reproduce. Men with the aptly named XX male syndrome are born with typical male reproductive systems and are raised male, but are genetically female. Yet you never see any TERFs include these guys in their definition of female, and since they believe sex and gender are the same, you don't see them included in their definition of womanhood either. There's no consistent and infallible biological reality to define someone's sex as a whole. The best anyone can do is look at the pieces and make a subjective judgment. When you call someone male or female, you're making a value judgment, picking one or several of these sex characteristics and giving them more or less value than the others. When a TERF says that a trans woman is biologically male because she has XY chromosomes, what they are doing is making a value judgment, defining absolute sex as the same as chromosomal sex. But, as they are unlikely to label a person with XX male syndrome as female, and they certainly don't consider him when they're speaking about females in general, what they are really saying is chromosomal sex is the most important part of defining sex when that person is trans. This applies to any definition of sex they give too. TERF saying that reproductive capabilities are what define sex is similarly inconsistent, as they certainly include women who are infertile and women who are born without reproductive systems in their definition of female. The subjective nature of defining sex allows them to constantly shift what they define as female to exclude those that they are bigoted against. Instead of letting the evidence define their beliefs, they are using their beliefs as a foundation for what evidence they choose to use, a practice that results in an inconsistent definition. They're using sex not only as a basis for their beliefs, but as a tool of exclusion and bigotry. Unfortunately, as you've seen, some trans people are guilty of this too. Transmedicalists are people, often trans themselves, that believe that the essence of being transgender, or transsexual as they would call it, is a discomfort with your birth, sex, and gender, and a desire to transition to the opposite sex and gender. They think, wrongly, that this gender dysphoria is necessary to be a valid trans person, and that a complete transition to the opposite sex should be the goal of every trans person. Mostly, it seems that transmedicalists believe this as it gives them a medical and scientific justification for their existence, and importantly, a way to gatekeep trans people they don't like and people they feel do not represent the trans community. This is a way of propping themselves up at the expense of other trans people. It gives them a way of separating the good trans people from the bad. And anyone they feel does not represent the trans community, well, they are obviously lying about their gender dysphoria. A typical goal of a transmedicalist is to be one of the good ones. And as it pertains to the topic of this video, in pursuit of that acceptance, they will often concede that they are biologically the sex they were assigned at birth, and that they transition to alleviate the dysphoria that comes from that. Their reliance on a sex binary precludes the existence of non-binary trans people, instead believing that non-binary people are simply wanting to be unique and changing their identity for personal reasons, unrelated to anything a transsexual would experience. Aside from falling into the same logical pitfalls when it comes to determining biological sex, this view also misunderstands what it means to be transgender. A transgender person is simply a person who decides they dislike living as their birth gender and transitions or desires to transition to another gender. What's important is that the person finds that they prefer living as a gender other than the one that they were assigned at birth. Non-binary people can experience gender dysphoria too. And to trans people who are sympathetic to transmedicalist ideas, even if they don't have dysphoria, and you can't imagine how they feel, or why they feel the way that they do, remember that cis people can't imagine how you feel, or why you feel the way that you do. This is why it's so important to trust people when they express their identity. Nobody knows them better than they know themselves, and as long as they're happier in their identified gender, then we should respect them and their identity. In my experience, gender dysphoria is related to both biological sex and gender, despite the name implying a tie to only gender. Using absolute biological sex to exclude people is exactly the same tactic that TERFs use against all trans people. By tying themselves so closely to biological sex, they are forced to uphold a system that wasn't designed with them in mind, and that discriminates against all people who don't fall perfectly into male or female. And that includes all transgender people who medically transition. And that is pretty much the entire transmedicalist movement. Relying on and upholding the system is unnecessary. Transmedicalists know that they are valid as trans people, but their inability to see past this flawed system leads them to believe that they need to submit to the system, to integrate rather than to advocate, doing so at the expense of those who can't integrate themselves through no fault of their own. This sounds familiar. Yeah, as I was saying, there are issues. I'm not saying there aren't issues. I just think it's a little bit ridiculous to take an action with consequences we can't even imagine, and only a few bad people are responsible for the damage done. And yeah, of course, we should help people who can't help themselves through no fault of their own. I don't mean to disparage them, but it seems more and more people are choosing to live that life and expecting us, the regular, hard-working people, to support them in their choice. It seems a little bit ridiculous to me. And yeah, there are a few good ones who understand that it's unjust to expect me to give them anything more than what they need as a member of our society to be productive. I live in the same system as everyone else, and I've never felt the need to manipulate other people for my own gain. Well, at least not outside the workplace, but the workers choose to work there. They can always work somewhere else. They know what they're getting themselves into.
Section 3. Deconstructing social constructs.
It can be intimidating to learn that something that you grew up with, dealt with, and lived with your entire life isn't as concrete as you thought it was. Imagining change to something like the concept of sex, or our government, or economic system can be incredibly difficult. Ben Shapiro himself lost his cool at the pretentious chords of John Lennon's Imagine. This difficulty isn't insurmountable, though. There's been a lot of effort and thought put into developing new and better ways of doing things. Our current system, though it is the one most familiar to us, hasn't been around forever. At some point in the past, it was designed and developed. Undoubtedly, it has evolved over the years, but it still reflects the values and desires of those who implemented it and benefit from it. Stepping back from what we assume are default, immutable, unchanging facts of life allows us to see them for what they are and how they're flawed. Understanding the systems that we live in and the value that we give things simply through tradition opens us up to thinking outside those systems. People like Ben Shapiro don't actually want to spread truth or encourage thinking. They are merely appropriating the aesthetics of intellectualism to discourage critically thinking about traditions and values. I would encourage everyone to do their own research, find facts, and come to their own conclusions. I've included the sources that I used in the description below. Feel free to start there. No harm can come from simply analyzing the systems that we grow up with. And it's only when we're thinking outside those systems that we open ourselves up to possibilities that could help everyone, instead of just those who abuse the system at the expense of everyone else. It's time to let old things die. Capitalism, biological sex, the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Let it all die. Audience, I want you to join me.
Thanks for making it to the end of the video. I want to thank everyone who helped me in the production of this video. It's bigger than anything I've done before, and I put a lot of work into it. So I really appreciate the people who helped me do that. I also have a Twitter now. You can follow me there.